Good morning, friends. Welcome to another section of With All Your Rights. This is attorney Cobo Estrella. I'm a federal trial attorney here in the District of Puerto Rico. Today we're going to be talking about, or we're going to continue talking about this topic that we've been talking from the past few weeks concerning, the equal rights of U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico. We're going to continue talking about this because there's a controversy surrounding the insular cases and the recent decision that came down from the U.S. Supreme Court in the U.S. versus Vallejo case. Essentially, this decision affirmed that Congress has the power to treat Puerto Rico different. In other words, it's kind of like a way to justify discriminatory treatment towards Puerto Rico U.S. citizens. This began back in 1901 when the U.S. Supreme Court made several decisions related to the insular cases. At that time, basically, it justified the racial segregation of Puerto Rico because, as you may recall, the U.S. Constitution has a territorial clause. This territorial clause basically gives Congress the power to regulate territories and properties belonging to the U.S. government. And as you may recall, Puerto Rico was acquired by the U.S. back in 1898 at the end of the Spanish-American War with the Treaty of Paris. These insular cases essentially established that Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory, and therefore the U.S. Constitution did not automatically apply here in Puerto Rico. Now, fast forward to today. Did you know that 3.2 million U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico have no voting representation in Congress? Did you know that U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico are not allowed to vote for presidents and vice presidents of the United States? Did you know that U.S. citizens here often are excluded from participating in federally funded programs? Today, many people attempt to justify this discriminatory treatment of Puerto Rico, arguing that Puerto Rico residents do not pay federal taxes. However, this statement is not true. Puerto Rico U.S. citizens contribute more in federal revenue taxes than 6 states of the Union. In other words, Puerto Rico contributes more to the federal budget than the states of Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Alaska. Puerto Rico U.S. citizens pay FICA, which includes Social Security, unemployment, and Medicare. Federal employees in Puerto Rico file federal tax forms and pay federal taxes. Federal contractors and suppliers as well. Businesses in Puerto Rico also pay federal taxes on income generated from sources outside of Puerto Rico, and also revenue transfer from the island-based subsidiaries to parent companies in the mainland also pay taxes. There's also taxes and tariffs on some of the entries of goods and products in Puerto Rico. For multiple purposes, and Puerto Rico de facto is considered a state. We have U.S. passports and U.S. citizenship by birth. We use U.S. currency. We use the U.S. Postal Service. We have a bankruptcy court, and we also have a federal district court. Immigration and borders are controlled by the U.S. We're subject to federal jurisdiction, and pretty much all the federal agencies and federal regulation apply in Puerto Rico. There's also several laws and court opinions that basically indicates that Puerto Rico is to be considered a state. We'll go further on this on future programs. So the question is, why today there are 3.2 million U.S. citizens with inferior or limited fundamental rights? We have no voting representation in Congress, no voting rights for President of the United States, despite being the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and Puerto Rico residents, many serving in the armed forces and being subject to federal jurisdiction. So what are we asking for? Equal rights for U.S. citizens living in Puerto Rico, regardless of Puerto Rico territory status, as an unincorporated territory, because we were granted U.S. citizenship by federal law over 100 years ago. And today we're natural-born citizens, despite the territory itself still being an unincorporated territory, having not been admitted as a state yet. But it is a territory that belongs to the United States and basically to the U.S. Congress, and its citizens are U.S. citizens. Which makes us recall one of America's fundamental dogmas: no taxation without representation. Our U.S. citizenship no longer depends on the place we live or reside, only where we were born, and therefore we should not be afforded limited or denied the right to exercise fundamental citizenship rights, such as voting. There is no place in America today for racial segregation or discrimination treatment of Puerto Rico U.S. citizens. No reasonable justification to treat us as foreigners in a domestic sense. Such policy, it would be considered by most racist, undemocratic, and un-American. There is no reason why U.S. citizens from Puerto Rico should be treated differently than the U.S. citizens from the 6 states we just identified, which contribute less in taxes to the federal government. The Puerto Rico Federal Relations Act specifically indicates in Section 734 that federal laws will apply in Puerto Rico. Section 737 states that the rights and privileges of U.S. citizens will be respected in Puerto Rico to the same extent as if Puerto Rico were a state. Yes, Congress has the power to treat its property, the territory itself, but not U.S. citizens, differently. We're asking for Congress to fully comply with its obligation under the Puerto Rico Federal Relations Act, and it has a duty to afford and recognize the fundamental voting rights in federal election of U.S. citizens, and to include Puerto Rico in its federal programs. It has a duty to the men and women who have given their lives defending democracy and freedom, and to the families of men and women who currently serve in the armed forces throughout the world. Because for over 100 years, the American flag has been flown on this island next to the Puerto Rico flag as a symbol of freedom and the U.S. presence on this island. We're asking the equal rights for the 3.2 million U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico who are subject to federal laws and jurisdiction, but who are excluded from participating in the election of federal public officials. We're asking Congress to enforce the Puerto Rico Federal Relations Act and or to amend the Constitution as it did back for blacks and for women to allow them to vote. Thank you for watching, and we hope this serves to educate and inform, because we care about the fundamental rights of all U.S. citizens living in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and hit the little bell so you will get notification of the next video we make. Thank you for watching.